Before you start going through this tutorial, what I want you to do is go to the Peak Performance Workbook questions for Chapter 5, and I want you to try in the warm-up question 4, A and B, and then in the training part, question number 7. So pause this now, have a go at those questions, and then come back to this tutorial. The tutorial today is going to be looking at food fuels, chemical and food required for the resynthesis of ATP and the utilisation of food for energy. So that is Key Knowledge 2.3. What I've got here is I've got a balance in terms of resynthesis and energy demand. So the aim with this one here is to say that we've got our resynthesis of ATP, and it depends on the intensity that we're working as to how fast or the rate that we need ATP resynthesized. The duration, the time we're working for, that will depend on the amount of ATP or the yield of ATP that we need resynthesized. And it will also depend on the athlete as well as to how that ATP is resynthesized based on their prior training and their biological makeup. We have already gone over this again, but it's always good to see it in some different sorts of ways. So what we're looking at here, if you look down the bottom, is we're looking at ADP. So ADP is the reduced version of ATP, and when ATP is reduced and it loses that phosphate or the bond that connects that phosphate gives us the energy required for muscle contraction, but we need to resynthesize that phosphate onto the ADP so that the process can occur around and around again. So this is quite nice, this orange little bit at the bottom here that says ADP plus free phosphate, or we've looked at it as inorganic phosphate, plus energy equals ATP. And that energy is created by food or by a substrate, which is a fuel within the muscle. And that energy is used to rejoin the free phosphate or the inorganic phosphate back onto ADP so that we can have ATP. If you look above, you absolutely do not need to know the structure of adenosine triphosphate. It is simply there for you to have a look at. So you can see AMP is with 1 phosphate, ADP with 2, and ATP triphosphate with 3 phosphates attached. So you know by now that we only have enough ATP for a couple of seconds or a couple of movements, and we need to resynthesize that so that we can continue to break down our ATP for use for muscle contraction. And the 3 energy systems work together to rebuild ATP or resynthesize. We have 2 energy systems that function at a fast rate, and they are called anaerobic energy systems. The word anaerobic means without oxygen. And we have 1 energy system that functions a little bit slower and it uses oxygen. It's called the aerobic energy system. Importantly, whenever you see that term interplay, you need to talk about how each of the energy systems works to resynthesize ATP together. And we've got, and I've used this one in class before, we need to have a balance of ATP and ADP. And when we start to exercise, we get an increase in ADP, and you can see that in the little seesaw there, and we get a decrease in ATP, and we need to correct that balance by resynthesizing ATP. What I want you to do now, you've seen this table many times before, I want you to pause this and I want you to have a go at filling out the answers for your food and chemical fuels. What I also want you to do is I want you to be familiar with each of those words and know when to use it. So know when to use carbohydrate, which is the fuel source or the food source for glucose and glycogen. So I want you to be able to use them, and I want you to use them correctly. So pause it now if you haven't already and fill in the table. Okay, go back and check from your chapter summary if you've done it correctly, and let's move on. The process of glycolysis is the breakdown of glycogen, and glycogen, or the food fuel carbohydrates, can be broken down aerobically and anaerobically. These two terms are really important for your glossary of terms. The incomplete breakdown of glycogen without oxygen is anaerobic, and the complete breakdown of glycogen with oxygen is aerobic. The complete breakdown is far more complex. It generates more energy though because it's a complete breakdown, but a disadvantage is that it takes much longer to do. So the process of glycolysis, if you look at that word, looks like glycogen, so it's the breakdown of glycogen, and you need to know definitions for anaerobic and aerobic. Now, which one, anaerobic glycolysis or aerobic glycolysis, which one is used depends on how fast you need the energy. And how fast you need the energy depends on the intensity that you are working. You can see fats and proteins can only be broken down aerobically. We don't talk that much about proteins' contribution to energy. We talk more about fats and carbohydrates because they are the dominant fuels at rest and during exercise. Protein is just for emergencies. This here looks a little complex, but let's try and break it down because it isn't that complex once we dissect it. I just want you to look at the orange part to start with. It's in the muscle. What you can see there is you can see the fuel that is in the muscle, triglyceride, which is the chemical version of fats, and glycogen. So when we need energy for muscle contraction, fuel gets broken down because it's the breakdown of the fuel that allows ADP to be resynthesized to ATP. So we get a breakdown of glycogen to glucose and triglyceride to free fatty acid. So that's just a simpler version of it. And then that is transported to the mitochondria. So we are talking right now, once it is in the mitochondria, about the aerobic metabolism. And indeed, triglyceride being broken down requires much more investment of energy to get triglyceride to free fatty acid rather than glycogen to glucose. So already you should be thinking, well, if that takes time to break down, then the rate of energy supply is going to be slower. And as such, the intensity is going to be lower when we're using that as our dominant fuel source. You can see that free fatty acids and glucose head towards the mitochondria. The mitochondria is the part of the cell where aerobic metabolism takes place. So oxygen gets utilized, and you can see oxygen going in there. Oxygen gets utilized here for that complete breakdown of the fuel. It's not a complete breakdown at glucose and free fatty acid. You don't need to worry about acetyl-CoA. It is just part of the breakdown of the fuel, but you do need to know the Krebs cycle and the electron transport system that the fuels go into in order to be broken down. And I showed you in class that Krebs cycle, the stages and how complex it is for the complete breakdown. And we require oxygen and oxygen investment in that phase in order to be able to break down the fuel. Now, what we're looking at here is we're looking at the transport of the fuel, so via blood. Because when we consume food and it goes into our stomach, we need it to get to our muscle, and so it's transported in the simpler version as free fatty acid, or it's transported as glucose. Really interestingly, what we can do during exercise and what people do is they eat a very simple form of carbohydrate in the form of glucose. So for those sorts of marathon events, they consume glucose, and then glucose is actually able to be pulled off by the muscle, and you can use that as a fuel. So we don't just have to rely on our stored version of glucose, which is glycogen in our muscle, because we can't store a lot, about 450 to 500 grams. We can utilize glucose as a fuel, and that is why people do so that we don't run out or our fuel isn't depleted. And you can see that we've got triglyceride, 12 kilograms, maybe more for some of us, maybe less for some of us, and that is going to be a really good source of energy, and we're going to have a look at that later. Remember, we can store glycogen in our liver, but note the difference. It's much lower storing of glycogen in our liver than it is in our muscle, and we've talked about that before as well. So the main glycogen we use when we exercise is glycogen stored at the muscle. This is another version of it. This is where we're talking about the aerobic breakdown of these food fuels, fats, carbohydrates, and proteins. So it's really good to be exposed to this in different ways. And this one, in fact, is a little bit different in that if you look down as carbohydrates, and probably if we're being really critical, would have glycogen in there. So glucose via the process of glycolysis gets broken down into pyruvate. And then remember, it can go one of two ways: the anaerobic pathway or the aerobic pathway. always going to go down both pathways. It just depends on how fast it's needed as to which gate is going to be wide open and which one is going to be recruiting more of the fuel to produce the energy. And we get here, when you think of carbon dioxide, water, ATP, you should be thinking there's one other thing that comes out. What is it? It's heat. You should be thinking of those as being byproducts. Don't worry about the term citric acid cycle. I guess it's good to be familiar that it exists, but we talk about it Krebs cycle and electron transport system or electron transport chain. So when we're talking about our fuels for energy, firstly, let's tick off protein. I know it's down the bottom, but it is used for growth and repair, negligible use during exercise, but it's really good post-exercise in order to repair damage that has been done. So our carbohydrates are our preferred source of fuel because they produce energy faster. However, we use fats during rest and submaximal because we've got a lot of it. So we've only got about 60, 92 hours worth of carbohydrates, depending on if we're well nourished or not. But fats, we've got, if you looked at that back at that triglyceride slide, where is it there? 12 kilograms, many, many days worth of fuel that we can utilize. So have a go at this question. The primary food fuel for energy production during maximal physical activity would be, what do you think? If you said D, you are correct. Now this is tricky because maximal physical activity, we use PC as our energy source, but the question's not asking that. It's asking us what the major food fuel is being used. So if we were to look at one of these three, best option, carbohydrates, because it's the one that we use more than the other two. In actual fact, we use PC more, but it's not a food fuel. So don't let that one trick you. This is complex and you don't need to know all these values. So what I want you to do is just pause me for a second and have a little bit of a look over. So pause it now. Okay, we're back. What I want you to do is I want you to look at this. I want you to look at these values here. That's why I've put this in. We've got running time at 75% of maximum heart rate. So at 75% of maximum heart rate, we're predominantly using the aerobic system. So we have 20 minutes worth of liver glycogen and we have 150 minutes worth of muscle glycogen, more muscle glycogen than liver glycogen. And then look at our adipose here, 2 to 3 days worth of, and that is actually working at 75%. So if we were just resting, we've got a lot more fuel that can be used for our energy. So that's what I want you to take out of that very complex table. Let's have a little bit of a look at the concept of glycemic index. So what I do want you to do is go back to that graph. Most of you analysed it to a good level. However, some of you could have analysed it more. The graph that I gave you, that I told you to annotate for your chapter summary. So the idea of glycemic index is a ranking from 1 to 100 of how fast sugar is present in the blood. So this is what they did. They gave 100 grams, I think it was 100 grams of glucose to many individuals. They did really extensive testing on this, and they looked to see what would happen to their heart rate response. I'll just see if we've got that. I don't have the graph there. Go and have a look. Have a look at the graph that you've got in front of you that I asked you to annotate. So if you look at what happened when they had 100 grams of glucose, they would have had a really high spike in blood sugar, because if you think of when you have lollies or those sorts of things, you get fast energy, a spike in blood sugar. What happens with high GI foods or foods such as pure glucose is that you get a spike, but then you get a drop, and quite a fast drop as well. So what they did is they tested people with 100 grams of glucose and they monitored their blood sugar response. And then what they did is they tested the same people with 100 grams of heaps of different other types of foods, and they compared that to the blood sugar response from 100 grams of pure glucose. So let's say, and bananas is a good one. Let's say they gave 100 grams of bananas to someone and then they tested for blood sugar response and they worked out an average of the thousands of people that they tested. So bananas tend to be a moderate GI. Actually depends on how ripe they are, interestingly. The riper the banana, the higher the GI. But they did this with lots of different foods. So yogurt, for example, is low GI, so it would have had a low number, maybe 30 or 40 when compared to glucose. So it's a number out of 1 to 100 based on the response that glucose made in people's blood. So when we have high GI foods, it has a quick breakdown and an immediate effect on blood glucose. And what does that mean? Well, it means that the blood glucose is going to travel to our muscles, and it means that the muscles can grab it and use it. So if we go back a bit here, if we go back to this slide here, if we're consuming glucose in high GI foods and it's coming in the blood, it's going to get dropped off to the muscle, and then the muscle's got a fuel available. So high GI food is going to be really useful during exercise and also to replenish glycogen at the end. It's not so good for when we're trying to concentrate, for example, because our brain feeds off glucose. And when we have a lot of glucose going to our brain and we're trying to concentrate on one thing, for example, it's quite hard for us. Lower GI is better because it's sustained energy release. So low GI is good for what's called a pre-event meal. So a pre-event meal is not what you are grabbing, like the lollies or something that you are grabbing on the way, running down, I don't know, wherever you run down the way onto the court, but it's, in actual fact, the pre-event meal is something that you'll have 2 to 3 hours prior. So 2 to 3 hours prior, you want to have a low GI because it's a slow breakdown. Just before exercise, just prior, then you could have some of the higher GI, but you can see here this, and this is really contentious. I debate this a little bit. I've included it because you might see it there. High GI food prior to exercise causes an insulin surge, which means that you tend to uptake more carbohydrates or you tend to use more glycogen. But when you're talking about a 2-3 hour event, it's negligible. It doesn't really matter. So just before an event, you could have something that's high GI, but 2 to 3 hours prior, it needs to be low GI. So here's some examples. See these numbers? Glucose, 100. That's the value that it gives. All the way down to, let's see, how did I go with yogurt? Oh, 15. No, I was a little bit off there. So bananas, depends, 62. Nudge it over into moderate if it's not as ripe. And so you might need to know some of these. They're not going to say, give us a value of lentils, for example, but what they might say in a question is, so-and-so had a meal of pasta and corn. Someone else had a meal just before, or there's a pre-event meal of lentils and peanuts. Which one would you recommend? And you might have to justify why low GI is going to be better. So you might get something like that, but you definitely don't have to know these values. They're just really interesting. They're interesting for your own education as well. Look how high carrot is. Only 2. Actually, that's really interesting. Didn't know that one. Okay, what we've got, the type of meal, all out cycling to exhaustion. After 2 hours of cycling at 70% of max for control, high GI and low GI meals. So look at that. Low GI, sustained energy release, and look how much they could go. So let me explain what happens here. What happens is the athlete consumes the food, control meal, a high GI meal and a low GI meal. So they consume those foods a couple of hours before. Then they jump onto the bike and they spend 2 hours cycling at 70% of VO2 max. Now we need to talk more about the difference between VO2 max and heart rate max, but we'll do so a little bit later. So they spend 2 hours cycling, and then what happens is the tester asks them to cycle as hard as they can. And then they test for how long they can keep up that pace. So the high GI, they could go to about 130 or 140 seconds. That's how long they could work to before they are exhausted. Whereas the low GI could go 210 to 15 seconds to exhaustion. So what does that tell us about the food? Well, it says that low GI is going to be better for sustained energy release because they worked for 2 hours before they did this high intensity effort. Go back over if you need to listen to that again, because that was actually quite a complex to interpret. Okay, so this question here, I want you to have a go at it and then pause, have a go, and then go through the answers. So our high GI, best used for immediately after the game, release energy rapidly, and low GI is best used before the game. The reason why that is because it has sustained energy release, energy slowly. So 38% got 4. That was pretty well understood. We also cover this quite a bit in Unit 4 Area of Study 2 as well. All right, so if we're looking at our food and chemical fuels, the percentages. You don't need to know the exact percentages, but I want you to have an idea of it. So during rest, our preferred source of fuel is going to be fats because we've got a lot of time for the body to be able to break down fats, and we don't need energy at a fast rate. So most of it is going to be aerobic metabolism. Remember, we're always going to have a little bit of anaerobic energy being produced, and that is going to use glucose or glycogen. During exercise, it's a little bit different because our anaerobic systems for short duration, high intensity are going to come into use, and long duration, the aerobic system is going to use a mixture of carbohydrates and fats. So what we've got here is we've got short duration max or maximal intensity activity. And remember, we're just talking about the food fuel here, carbohydrates and fats. We're not talking about PC because during short duration maximal activity, that's going to play a huge role. So you can see we've got a large percentage of carbohydrates and a very small percentage of fats being broken down, and most of the carbohydrate is going to be broken down anaerobically. When we get that breakdown, we get our byproducts. ATP is a byproduct, and lactic acid, which breaks down into lactate and hydrogen. And during prolonged submaximal activity, don't you love that 2 slides ago or 3 slides ago, they say it doesn't use protein and they slide it in here. It's always a bit of a mixture. We know that protein isn't going to be used unless it's emergency. So prolonged, perhaps that might be for a really long time, but let's just be critically reflect on that when we see it. So carbohydrates and fats during prolonged submaximal activity. In fact, if we actually are going to be really critical, if we're looking at prolonged, that term normally means more than 2 hours. And if we're looking at it more than 2 hours, depending on where we're looking at it, that fat contribution is going to be a little bit higher than that as well. To me, that looks about 80-20, which isn't right for a 2-hour event. But the concept is right in that we use more aerobically than anaerobically, which you see up the top. Ooh. Crossover concept, one of my favorite. There's 2 ways we can look at this. The first way we're looking at it, the crossover concept, is a percentage of intensity. So down the bottom on the x-axis, it's a percentage of VO2 max. So the higher VO2, remember that means oxygen consumption. So the higher we are in terms of our percentage VO2 max, the harder we're working, the more oxygen that we're consuming. So on the y-axis, it's a percentage energy contribution from fats and carbohydrates. Down the bottom towards the left-hand side of the graph, at a low VO2 max, we're not working very hard. We don't need energy at a fast rate. And when I say energy, I mean resynthesis of ATP. So we've got a higher percentage of fats than carbohydrates, whereas when we move up to 100% or upwards, when we're working really hard, we're going to use carbohydrate as the dominant fuel source because it provides energy faster. So my question to you is, what would happen after a lot of training as what's called a chronic adaptation to training? What would happen to that line? And the answer